Erica, thank you for the invitation, and thanks to Mark as well for having me this year. I really appreciate the chance to share some of our findings. And today, what I prepared for you guys is actually a question that I think is pretty relevant in these days, because if you look at the news today, it's you're always thinking or getting the sense that the TV business is becoming like the movie business, right? So it's being more controlled by tentpoles, right? Because that's what you hear day to day. There's all this news about it. And really we wanted to approach this question more from a research perspective, and the fact that we can track both supply and demand basically give us the tools to actually measure this. And that's what we're going to present today. So we're going to present mainly what is it that is shaping all these streaming wars. And if you think about it, or if we classify content in two buckets, like Tentpoles versus Longtails, who's winning that war, I guess? That's like the big question that we have. So I'm gonna share. Let me know, guys, if you got to see my screen. You see
Looks great.
Okay, yeah. So let me, as I was saying, we read the news, there's a lot of noise about how all of these TV hits are becoming more popular, right? You look at the amount of spending that the networks are putting into TV is also incredible, right? So we get the sense, if we stick with the news headlines, we get the sense the TV business is now becoming a blockbuster dominated business. And we wanted to test that hypothesis, right? So what we did was the following. We actually looking only at the US. We review over 100 platforms that are basically in the catalogs of the platforms that they have here in the US. That would be in total more like 10,000 shows. So we actually reviewed 10,000 shows that are present on these catalogs. And then, as I was saying in the beginning, we tried to classify them into two buckets. Very simple. We said okay, let's just rank them by popularity. And then the top 20%, let's call them tentpoles. And then the bottom 80%, we're gonna call them Longtails. Just a simple classification so that we can start kind of get a sense of how this looks like in terms of demand, which is actually what we measure, right? So what is demand, and how do we get, or how does a tentpole look like compared to a long tail? If we go to a tentpole like Stranger Things, the way we measure demand is actually capturing all of the signals that you can capture from consumers that are expressing demand for this title. So this could be anything from a Google search to even watching a trailer on YouTube, or maybe even visiting the Wikipedia page of the show. So all of these signals are being collected. And in here, what I'm showing you is just an aggregation that tells you, for this show in particular, where are the signals coming from? Is it coming from social media? Is it coming from peer-to-peer streams, which we also capture? Is it coming from research activities, Googling or visiting Wikipedia? Or is it coming from just watching some videos on YouTube or Dailymotion, right? So that's what you see the breakdown here. What we do as a company is we actually basically combine all of these different signals, and based on the amount of effort that it takes to do each of these activities, then we give a weight, so that at the end of the day, we have a way to compare two different shows. Because if you think about the other show that I'm using as an example of a long tail, like Murder, She Wrote, for example, what you're gonna see here is essentially you're gonna see the same sources. So we're looking at the same sources, but the distribution is gonna be different, right? Because people may react to that show in a different way. In any case, the methodology applies to both. And what we're doing is collecting all of these signals, and then we're giving a weight, so that at the end of the day, we can kind of, based on the amount of effort that it takes to complete all of these activities, that becomes a way to quantify attention. And once we quantify attention, at the end of the day, and then we can compare two titles, right? And that's what we have here. So a tentpole title, in this case, Stranger Things, would have, for this period that we're measuring, it has more 81.6 times the demand of the average title that we're seeing. So it's 81 times as popular as the average title. And like Murder, She Wrote, for example, is 1.7 times as popular. So we get the sense of what are like, in terms of, dimension, what is the difference between a tentpole and a long tail, right? So we start from there. These are like just two examples, but we're gonna go deeper to really understand like what are the dynamics in each of these like two type of like shows, right? So if we analyze that, what we're gonna see is the following: is essentially we look at 2017. Again, like looking at those two buckets, tentpoles against Longtails, and then we aggregated the demand from all of these titles. And what we're seeing is like, tentpoles are getting close. This is back in 2017. They were like below 80%, but they were getting there. And Longtails were a little bit above 20. So it's interesting because like, you look at these numbers and you're like, okay, this is a Pareto efficiency rule, I guess, right? It's like, it's playing out. So like the top 20% of the titles, which we consider tentpoles, are actually delivering 80% of the demand, which again, remember that demand is a quantification of attention, consumer attention. So that's what we're seeing in 2017. Let's see what happens 1 year later. It's actually, yeah, we're seeing that this is increasing. So now actually tentpoles go over 80%. And actually now Longtails dropped below 20. And then we go to 2019, essentially more or less, it keeps like the trend keeps continuing. So what we're seeing is like, we started with that big question, is the TV becoming like a blockbuster dominated like movies? And what we're seeing is like, yeah, in a way is we see certain dynamics and it's going in that direction. But in any case, like, Longtails still kind of represent a significant portion of that, right? Because like, and that's, we wanted to kind of explore both sides of the coin, right? And one of the things that we can do is like, and this comes back to some of the tools that we provide so that we actually can go deeper and understand the dynamics under this, is like, we have a product called Monitor, which essentially allows you to see how popular any TV show is. So we go in there because we want to know exactly what is it, what's driving this like, tentpoles popularity. What we see is the following. We wanted to do an analysis that shows, okay, let's just pick the top 5% of the titles, and then let's see what is the demand that those top 5% have, and that's actually 43% of the demand. So now we're getting like more granular, right? So we started from the top 20%, we saw that they were getting about 80%, but now we go to the top 5% of the titles, it's almost 43% of the demand. And more than that, like if we go into the specifics, here what I'm gonna show you is the top 5 titles so that you see where they stand compared to the average. What you're seeing here is like, imagine like the popularity as a spectrum. So if I go back to here, like this is 0 popularity. And if I go back to here, this is over 100x, so 100 times as popular. And in here you have 1x, which is the average, right? So like, if we put in like those 10,000 titles under this curve, distribution curve, then like this is a way to actually understand how popular like TV shows are, which goes back to that the product that I was telling you that we can offer you this view very instantly. Just going into like the portal, you can actually see this. But in any case, for 2017, what we see for the Big Bang Theory, it was like in this quadrant that we call outstanding, where like only like 2.7% of the titles actually make it over there. And it was like about 20 times as popular as the average title. If we continue on, we see that The Flash is at 23. We see that Rick and Morty is at 25. And then we see, of course, Game of Thrones. And then we see The Walking Dead. So Game of Thrones and The Walking Dead are the only ones that actually make it all the way to like this spectrum of the distribution curve, which is above 32x. Which in the model that we have created, basically it becomes like an exceptional title, which is in a way like it's getting closer to like the real tentpoles, of those markets. And again, like this was done for 2017 in the US. And then the question is like, how has this changed if we go back to 2019? So that we see like a 2-year basically evolution of these trends. And what we're seeing in 2019 is essentially, it is becoming more concentrated. So now like the top 5% of the titles actually generate 48% of the demand, so up from 43 in 2017. And then interesting enough, when you look at the details of each of these titles, you see like all of them are already like in the exceptional category, right? So, and in this case, these are like the top 5 titles that we saw in 2019. So all of them now are kind of like in the top, say, top tier of this like normal distribution that we find in the entertainment business. So interesting, like, so that's what we've seen. We've seen like, yeah, it is becoming more concentrated. And one of the reasons that we kept wondering is like, okay, what's driving that? Why is it becoming like that, you know? And we're seeing, you know, from the news that, yeah, people are investing more money and all that. And one of the interesting things that we found, and let me walk you through this because this could be a little bit complicated, but in any case, I want to show you that, for example, in the case of Netflix, if we look at the amount of subscribers that they have in North America, so like US and Canada, it's actually these like gray dots that you see here. Over time, you see how they're increasing from like under 55 million back in 2017 to more than 70, you know, like this year, really. So like this gray dot points basically tells you like the amount of subscribers that Netflix have. And interesting enough, we actually track the demand for Netflix originals, and that's the red line that you see here. So in a way, we found it very interesting that, you know, again, like the demand becomes like an early indicator of like how many subscribers you're gonna have. And based on that, then we started to understand why, you know, like why is like people are getting more interested in Tentpoles, because when you think about Netflix in particular, we actually reviewed about 492 originals. And out of those 492, like 137 actually fit the Tentpole definition that we had for this analysis. And these 137 titles were actually driving 85% of the demand, right? So when you think about like this correlation that exists between demand, which is the metric that we measure, and between subscribers, which is obviously the key performance indicator that Netflix may have as a company, then like you understand why, you know, like Tentpoles makes sense, you know, for a company like Netflix. But that doesn't mean that there may be other opportunities outside like the big Cs, right? And that's what we're gonna show here, because actually, again, if we go back in time, and what we have here is like we've been tracking new shows being available. And this is, when we're talking about new shows, it's not only shows made in the US, but shows made everywhere, pretty much. And all types of shows, like documentaries and like, you know, realities and factuals. So all of that is actually included in this graph. And what you see is like there's a trend that is like every year we're adding about like 1,700 shows. So that makes us wonder, like, look, it's like there's a lot of content, and the supply of content is increasing. And of course, like there's gonna be more opportunities in the long tail, because like if you're able to identify out of those shows, you know, that may not be like the tentpoles per se, but what are those shows that may resonate with people, then there's an opportunity in there, you know, which I think one of the advantages of the OTT business model is now that you're cutting down all the distribution costs of doing this. So like this intermediation process that is happening, it allows people to discover this type of long tail content more easily. And that's actually what we see when we actually track the demand on a per title basis. What we're showing here is actually how people have expressed the demand for long tail shows over time. So if we index this as 100 in 2017, what we see is like over time, you know, like those long tail, the average long tail title is actually getting more popular. So, and I think a lot of the reason is because now it's a lot easier for people to consume this. So all of a sudden, like you may have a long tail title that at the end is having like a wider addressable market, just because of the fact that it's easier to really consume, right? And that's what we're seeing. So, I mean, I think, again, like we look at this data, even though there's more concentration, I think there's a lot of opportunities on the long tail side. So it's almost like, it all depends on like what you're trying to go after. But it seems like the market is big enough so that you can actually start looking for opportunities to really monetize content at all levels, tentpoles and long-tails. So let me quickly show you, I just want to finalize, just so I can miss last portion, tell you what's the difference between one and the other one. So when you look at long-tails, what you're going to find is it's more like the old shows. It really is 56% of them have already completed, as opposed to in the tentpoles where you actually have more current titles. You also see that for Longtails, actually there's more international titles. So that's another characteristic. And this is just a graph that tells you for those international titles where they're coming from. And again, the two top markets would be the UK and South Korea. Okay, so just so that you get a sense of, for these long-tail titles, where are they coming from? And then the last point in here, because just showing the contrast between the two, what we've seen is there are certain genres that are overrepresented for long-tails. So what you're gonna find is there are more dramas, there are more documentaries. And in tentpoles, actually, you're gonna find more action and adventure, more children. So those are the type of things that you see in terms of supply of content. But what's interesting about this, and again, this is just showing if you were to do a mix, what is the mix of titles that you have in those two markets? But what's interesting is actually also looking at this demand of these titles. And let me just walk you through here because I think it's interesting. That what you actually find is even though dramas, there's a lot of a lot of quantities in dramas in the long-tails, they're actually struggling to get as much demand. So what we're showing here is essentially this, the purple bar is showing you the percentage of supply that represents, and the yellow bar represents the demand that they're able to get. So in this case, there's actually a deficit. So if I were to kind of play in the long tail game, maybe dramas is an area that may be a little bit oversaturated because there's a lot of supply, but there's not enough demand. And there's a gap. So that, in a way it's not as attractive. If you compare that with comedy, for example, is the opposite. In the case of comedy, what you find is actually, even though it represents 17% of the market for long-tails, it actually captures 19% of the demand. So really, this is what this is telling you is if I were to play, if you're gonna play in the long-tail market, I think comedies would be an interesting market to play in. And then just a couple of things just to finalize is if we want to look at the different platforms, this is the platforms that have the highest concentration of long tail titles. So the way to read this would be Curiosity Stream would have 84% of their titles is actually on the long tail. And then Rakuten Wiki is 83% and so on. So interesting enough, again, there's so many platforms out there. There are platforms that are going after specific markets. And I think this opens opportunity to actually, to thrive in this long tail content. And then to finalize, I just wanted to show you what has happened in 2020 since we saw the trend that it's becoming more concentrated. And I guess what happened after COVID, so just wanted to quickly show you what happened. And it's interesting because what we're seeing is at the beginning, we saw a flock to tentpoles in a way. So actually especially after confinement, or even before that, we were seeing the trend of tentpoles growing, and actually this is the curve of long-tails coming down. So the percentage amount of long-tails were coming down initially in the year, but then I think after a certain point, there hasn't really been that many new productions, and I think people are struggling, and people have more time to actually consume other stuff. And what we're seeing now is a sustained growth for like this type of content. So it seems like, you know, again, like people are now more open to exploring like old catalog, exploring like maybe very niche content, and it seems like there's going to be opportunities coming in that regard. So we're kind of like, it would be interesting to see what happens. You know, we're only seeing like up to like today, I guess, but we're going to see like what's going to happen to the end of the year, because it seems like Longtails is on the rebound. Yeah, so with that, I think I'm just going to stop here. I'm not sure if there are any questions or anything.
That's perfect. Great job, Alejandro. That's really, I really love parrot analytics analysis and the idea of quantifying attention. It's very interesting concept. Super cool. Yeah, we have some great questions. I'm gonna read some off here, and we'll see if we can get to as many of us as we can. From Allison Martin. Thank you, Allison. Do you see a difference in demand on titles that have a lot of seasons versus mini-series or shorter series runs?
Yeah, so I mean, it's like there's always going to be differences across, like, you know, like how, like, you know, like the number of seasons and like the length or the format of the shows. I haven't really done like that analysis in particular. Is something that we can certainly do, because like at the end, like, you know, we have like over 10,000 titles that we track, and we can kind of categorize that to see what you know, if there's any specific statistically significant trend that we can kind of point out. What I can tell you is that, you know, it's like essentially like a lot of, like, since COVID, a lot of trends have changed, you know, so it's almost like we always have to kind of like maybe do this analysis and be like, okay, what happened before and after COVID, and then let's see if that's sustainable, you know. So, but that's certainly something that we can explore.
Yeah, you could dig into your data and pull it out. It's a great question. Does the data for Longtail and Tentpole growth correlate with actual viewing rather than just demand? So the relationship between what you're tracking and what people actually do.
Yeah, so I mean, it's like on the aggregate, there's like a strong correlation, I think, between like viewing and demand in general. That's what we're seeing, you know, when we're doing like this type of analysis. But on specific titles, there may be differences. And it may be as simple as the fact that we actually track demand even before a title is available, right? So we are actually able to tell you, you know, like maybe there's a title that has, I mean, we have zero viewership because it hasn't been available yet, but there's a lot of demand for it because people are looking for, like, are searching for it, are commenting about it, are expecting it, right? So then, like, just on that regard, like, you're gonna see that, wait, like, there's a number here, like, you know, there's not a relationship in there. But once it's on air and once it's like available, I mean, for the most part, that kind of like, you know, holds. But there's also another thing, is like, I mean, I think part of what we capture goes beyond viewership, right? It's more about like how people interact with this content and how important it is. Because if like a title is very important for you, say like you're really a fan of like Game of Thrones, you may watch the show and that may count as one view, let's say, but you would also spend a lot of time researching, you know, like reading like blogs and like maybe watching all these like hypotheses of what's gonna happen or what happened, or like reading more about like each of the characters. And that's time that we actually capture, and that's time. And in our data, what it would show is like, look, like this show has like a really strong emotional component to it, and it has a strong demand because people really. So it goes. That's what I'm saying. Is like it goes beyond like viewership. It goes more like really how people care about these shows, and that's why we find like strong correlations with subscribers. I mean, we think that that's why, because like it becomes more, not so much, okay, like did you watch the show or not? It's more about like, do you care about that show? And if you care about that show, are you going to become a subscriber? You know, so I think that's really the dynamics that, of course, these are very complex dynamics, but in a way we uncover some of these mechanisms, and it's pretty interesting. We've done like correlations with like companies' KPIs to understand like the impact of like, say, like adding, I don't know, like animation series that are on exclusive, you know, as exclusive, you know, and you can compare that against like what happened before and after, and what was the impact that had in like in the number of subscribers, or like even like things like your marketing costs. Was it easier to attract customers or not? So many different things that we can do, and it's just like it's so interesting to actually be able to to capture all of this data and really be able to kind of start playing with it, really understand what it means.
Yeah, it truly is. We're going to take one more question, and then I do want to suggest that all of you that are here, and we may not have a chance to get everybody's questions, or interested in digging more to this, reach out. Alejandro is here. You can find him on our speaker page and our contact page, and you can use the functionality within our website and the system itself to reach out and send a message to Alejandro and get in touch. Who knows, he may be hanging out with us at lunch or in the lounge or in happy hour later on today as well. So show up there and we can all discuss this stuff a little more. One more question from Connie Harrison. It's about the awards. So Emmy and Academy Awards, how are they correlated to the Tentpoles or the combo of Tentpoles and Longtails? So how do the awards impact that?
Yeah, actually, what we have found, we've done some analysis on that, and I think what's interesting is like, whenever a series gets any type of awards, like an Emmy award, then like the demand like skyrockets right afterwards. So that's for sure. And then like what's interesting is like for some shows, like it just jumps and then it sticks. But so some shows it jumps, but then it drops significantly, right? So yeah, I mean, I think awards definitely play a part, but I see it more as more like as a marketing device. At least that's how we see it in terms of our data. So it's like, it would drive like certainly more demand, and then you have to see if you're able to kind of like sustain that demand, right? And that depends on every show. Yeah.
Well, thanks once again. I know I'm going to go back and watch this video, which brings up a good point. All of you can check it out again, as well as all of our other content. We'll be loading it up on the agenda, and you can watch OTTX Summit on demand as much as you want for free if you're a registrant to the event. So by all means, take advantage of that. So we are at time for our conference this morning, and it means it's time for lunch. Hope you all join us for the networking lunch that is going on even now. You'll find it on the agenda. You click into there.
Hi, Eric, one last thing.
Yes.
I forgot to mention, we actually we have a discount for people who want to kind of go into our portal. So I'm gonna paste it in here. I think, let's see if it works.
Yeah.
So if you're interested in terms of really just looking at our site in terms of collecting this data for the different shows, we have a product that is more geared towards personal accounts. So I'm gonna post here this is a link that you can kind of go in there.
It's in the chat.
You get a 20% off if you guys want want to sign up. So that's
terrific, Alejandro. I'm gonna touch base with you on that later too. Let's see if we can find a way to make that persist a little bit longer than this session does.
Yeah, I know for sure. We can certainly make it
relevant
to the OTX members.
All right, terrific. Yeah, great idea.